Welcome to this presentation on pH. I decided to build this for two reasons. One, and most importantly, is a crucial concept to understanding the microbiome and how to optimize it. And second, as the former director of medical education for a microbiome firm, and now with my own platform, I often get questions about pH, as people have heard of the alkaline diet and therefore think that the pH of the intestines should also be alkaline. Given this misplaced thinking, I'm forced to cover the alkaline diet misconceptions in addition to the pH of the microbiomes of the intestines and the vagina to drive home my philosophy and my protocols. If you don't remember from school, pH is a measure of acidity or alkalinity. The lower the pH, the more acidic. The higher, the more alkaline. A pH of 7 is neutral. The pH scale is logarithmic, so what appears to be a small difference of 1 is actually tenfold. The pH in a healthy body varies on location, and in the unhealthy versus the healthy, the same locations can have different pHs. For example, depending on the reference, the pH of the human stomach is 1.5 to 2. That's really acidic, and for good reason. Is this something you want to make alkaline? I don't think so. PPIs lower stomach acid availability, in other words, they increase pH, but the repercussions on the microbiome are terrible. For more on that, watch my presentation entitled Stomach Acid Blockers and Their Effects on the Microbiome. When you look at the guidelines for the alkaline diet, it's like any other crazy diet, like the low FODMAPs diet. Some of the principles are sound, but then they also say just crazy stuff. As for sound principles, alcohol, sweeteners, deli meats, and white flour are foods you should avoid or consume less of. But everyone says this. As for crazy land, and never mind the inconsistencies between these charts, you're not going to convince me to avoid blueberries, walnuts, or cold water fish, or for that matter, basically become a vegan. That's just ridiculous. First of all, there has never been a successful human civilization that was vegan. Second, I've been in the natural functional medicine industry for over 20 years, and when I see these hardcore vegans, they are some of the most unhealthy people you'll ever see. Now, with that said, many countries, including the United States, consume more animal protein than is needed. Like all things, moderation is key. Now let's understand the biochemistry of pH in your body, and then we'll get to the microbiome. Your body keeps your blood pH at about 7.4 with very minor variation. If you do vary too much, I hope you have good life insurance. Point being is you're not going to make your body more alkaline than this. So if the healthy empty stomach is 1.5 to 2, the blood is 7.4, and things we'll get to later, the rest of the GI tract ranges from mid-5s to mid-7s, and the healthy vagina is low 4s, then what are you alkalizing? Nothing. What you're doing is trying to relieve the compensatory mechanisms in the system. Trust me, blueberries, walnuts, and reasonable cold water fish consumption are not your enemies. The two things that are proven to be a strain on the compensatory mechanisms are salt and protein intake. Now, I fully advocate for being an omnivore, but an intelligent one. And depending on the person and given tendencies and blood pressure balance, some people can use salt more liberally than others. However, the data is very clear, so let me explain what you're actually accomplishing. Many studies clearly show a direct correlation between protein consumption and calcium excretion in the urine. The pH of the blood does not change. The body compensates by pulling calcium from bone tissue to neutralize the acid balance. So obviously, if you're concerned about osteoporosis, this is relevant news. Probably the most damning evidence is on the sulfur in amino acids like methionine and cysteine. Sure, there is sulfur in plant food, but the content is 2 to 5 times higher per unit in animal-derived proteins. And how often does someone eat a 16-ounce serving of walnuts anyway? Fruits and vegetables are metabolized to bicarbonate, which helps with compensating for animal protein, and bicarbonate itself in studies improves calcium metabolism. On the flip side, studies show that giving methionine or salt increases calcium excretion dramatically. So you can take dietary measures to improve the burden on the compensatory mechanisms in your body, but you're not going to alkalize yourself. And there are definitely parts of you where you don't want to. I mentioned the stomach before. The vagina is another location you want to be acidic. As the microbiome expert, I'm usually focused on the intestinal microbiome. But there is a microbiome on and in every part of you, to include the vagina. and this is something you don't want to alkalize. In this study, 396 asymptomatic women who represented 4 ethnic groups underwent vaginal microbiome analysis. The bacterial communities clustered into 5 groups. As you can see here on Table 1, 4 of the groups were dominated by a Lactobacillus species, while Group 4 was not, but instead it was more of a diverse community. This diverse community had a pH in the mid-5s, which doesn't sound like much of a difference, but it is. The lowest pH, with a median of 4.0, was in the group dominated by Lactobacillus crispatus, which is protective against preterm delivery. The vaginal microbiome not only can play a role in preterm delivery, but also in bacterial vaginosis, sexually transmitted infections, urinary tract infections, and yeast infections. Other studies show benefits for a lower pH, more acidic, in Lactobacillus crispatus, as we'll now see. Given the prevalence and risks of mortality of preterm birth, and how a dysbiotic vaginal microbiome increases the risk twofold, these researchers analyzed the microbiome of 40 women during gestation and post-delivery. You can see in Figure B that the Lactobacillus-dominated vaginal microbiomes, represented by shades of green and blue, had a near-zero risk for preterm birth, whereas the more diverse microbiome, which lacked Lactobacillus dominance as seen in pink, showed a far higher risk profile for preterm birth. If you recall from the previous slide, the similar group had the highest pH, which is a bad thing. It reinforces the exceedingly important concept that the pH of the microbiome plays a key role in which members of a given microbiome tend to dominate. As African American women are twice as likely to be diagnosed with bacterial vaginosis and are twice as likely to experience preterm birth, the investigators compared the vaginal microbiomes based on race. The results mimic those of our previous studies. Not only was Lactobacillus crispatus found to be health-promoting, they also state that women colonized with L. crispatus have been shown to have a 5-fold decreased risk for developing bacterial vaginosis. The risks of bacterial vaginosis also predispose women to serious health issues, including pelvic inflammatory disease, increased risk for the acquisition and transmission of HIV and other sexually transmitted diseases. So clearly, when it comes to vaginal health, a few species of Lactobacillus driving a very low pH are important. Therefore, it may be logical to assume that Lactobacillus driving a low pH, a more acidic environment, in the gut would also be beneficial. After all, there are many supplements with Lactobacillus species in them. However, your assumption would be wrong. The overall data across all diseases/health concerns for Lactobacillus is very ugly, as you'll learn as you watch more of my presentations. Lactobacillus is one of many different bacteria in the microbiome which produce lactate, but one of a few which produce it as its primary end product. And it's this lactate which helps drive down the pH. But Lactobacillus does so robustly and with high acid tolerance. As you saw earlier, the pH of the healthy vagina was 4.0. This pH is far lower than the sweet spot for the true health promoters in the gut. Under normal conditions, there are lactate-consuming bacteria, some of which are highly beneficial, which keep lactate levels in check at very low thresholds. However, if this threshold is crossed, in the case of dysbiosis, then a spiral of lactate production decreases pH, which disables the consumption of lactate from the good bacteria, and can switch to feed other lactate consumers who are bad bacteria such as E. coli, C. diff, Campylobacter, and Salmonella. This condition is referred to as lactate accumulation, and is seen especially in ulcerative colitis. As you see here in this ulcerative colitis study, lactate levels clearly increase with increasing severity. As the lactate accumulation worsens, the all-important short-chain fatty acids are reduced. In a nutshell, we're talking about which bacteria are happiest in which environment. And sadly, the good guys are happy in a narrow range, like Goldilocks. Our planet is in the Goldilocks zone from the sun, not too hot and not too cold. Well, the health-promoting bacteria are much the same, not too acidic and not too basic. If it is, then they get outcompeted for resources, and when they do, they can't do good things, and the bad guys who can survive and thrive outside this zone can do bad things. Do you want some more proof? Streptococcus and Enterococcus are also key lactate producers, and they are known opportunistic pathogens. And their data is very ugly for ulcerative colitis, just like these two you see here, your probiotics, lactobacillus, and bifidobacterium, whose primary end product is also lactate. As you can see, when a significant difference was found in a study, most of the time, these bacteria were significantly higher in ulcerative colitis subjects. I even provide you with the PMIDs to look up for yourself if you don't believe me. Now, bifidobacterium in general is a health-promoting genus. It just so happens that in ulcerative colitis, supplementation with bifidobacterium is probably not a good idea, and probably worse as the severity increases. You can learn much more about this in my presentation on ulcerative colitis. Lactobacillus, on the other hand, is a different animal. Lactobacillus is not a health promoter outside of infants and vaginal health. And lactobacillus is the main player driving this lactate accumulation in ulcerative colitis. Now, am I saying that all dysbiosis is lactate accumulation? No. In fact, the majority is where the pH is too high, but again, outside the Goldilocks zone. But this is important enough to discuss and highlight the various possibilities and factors within the complex world of the microbiome. So how do we get out of this mess of lactate accumulation? Well, I'm not going to get into this study design, we'll just say it was very thorough. What these researchers did was use the gold standard fecal microbiota transplant, FMT, to evaluate at various time points which bacteria were involved in the improvement of ulcerative colitis. As pertaining to our discussion on lactate, two of the key bacteria determining a positive response in ulcerative colitis symptoms are Eubacterium hallei, now Anaerobutyricum hallei, and Anaerostipes hadris. Both of these health-promoting species convert lactate directly to butyrate, which is very uncommon. They are just a small handful of bacteria known to do this. Other key health promoters were also determinants of improvement, to include some now familiar names like Roseburia inulinivorans, Pneumococcus bromii, and Eubacterium elegans. So, depending on various factors, those subjects who were able to adopt more of the health promoters via FMT went into symptom remission, while those who adopted a post-FMT profile with fewer health promoters had more classic opportunistic pathogens such as Escherichia and Veillonella. Now, am I promoting FMT for everyone with dysbiosis? No. This is here to build your understanding. What I am promoting is the next best thing, the intelligent use of properly blended and dosed prebiotics to suit the needs of the individual. The goal being to dramatically alter the gut environment to one that favors the health promoters, so they in turn can keep the bad actors in check. This is how I want to arrive in the Goldilocks zone. And so what exactly is that zone? As you can see, the pH varies a bit from location to location, as does the microbiome. Depending on oxygen presence, substrate availability, bile acids, and pH, the players in the GI microbiome are not the same from one spot to another. Although references always vary, the color representation basically show what Table 1 describes, is that the intestines have a pH ranging from mid-5s to mid-7s, depending on location. That's generally acidic, and that's a good thing. Like in the vagina, you want to strive for a more acidic environment. But unlike in the vagina, in the intestines, you don't want a lot of lactic acid, which, by the way, is an organic acid, not a short-chain fatty acid. You want short-chain fatty acids to keep the pH somewhat acidic. Many bacteria produce short-chain fatty acids, and most of the time, the true health promoters produce butyrate, which is the king. So let's get more precise. In this in vitro experiment with two different pHs of 5.5 and 6.5, and the addition of lactate or not, the bacteria within the system were measured for response. I know this slide is dense, and there are a few things I could highlight, but the key points are the response to pH. D2, D7, and D19 represent the inocula from the three donors. We can see at a pH of 5.5, the butyrate in orange was flatlined in two of the three, while for those same two, lactate rose. This is something seen repeatedly in the data. At pHs which are too low, the health promoters are inactive or even possibly killed, while lactate producers like species from Lactobacillus can thrive, driving a spiral resulting in lactate accumulation and lacking in butyrate and propionate. On the right, you can see a switch when the pH is increased to 6.5, still acidic. And here we see butyrate, still in orange, higher than lactate, which is at rock bottom in purple. Here we have one of my favorite papers of all time. These researchers used 4 different levels of acidity in a controlled in vitro environment to measure the growth of various bacteria using the common prebiotics inulin and pectin, 2 of the prebiotics I recommend. At varying levels of acidity, different bacteria can outcompete others. They state that, quote, at pH values closer to neutrality, that would be 7, our evidence suggests that other bacteria will tend to outcompete Bifidobacterium for inulin. Now we know that Bifidobacterium loves inulin, but we also know that there are other bacteria, some of whom are more or less neutral bystanders, while others are bad actors who possess the enzymatic machinery to also degrade inulin, or another prebiotic, and use it for themselves. It's not just the good guys who consume prebiotics, although on average, the health-promoting taxa favor these substrates, while the opportunistic pathogens tend to favor others like protein. At higher pH values, the good guys tend to get outcompeted. For example, and the second to last point, Eubacterium rectale, which is incredibly beneficial, appears to be inactive and outcompeted by Bacteroides at a pH of 6.7, but is very happy at a pH of 5.5. I can guarantee that most of the time, the luminal environment of the dysbiotic gut has a higher pH than it should. Again, speaking of E. rectale, here these researchers showed the same exact thing. It's not the same paper, there are 7 years in between them. Bacteroides was hindered at 5.5, but grew very well at 6.7. E. coli was hindered at 5.5, but E. rectale grew very well at the same pH, but was undetectable at 6.7. You can see to the right the drastic differences in the colored circles, which reflects the abundance of different members of the microbiota. This radical change is driven by a change in pH, from at either 5.5 or 6.7. Just think about the radical shifts in your microbiome from what appear to be small changes. And not only the bacteria themselves changing, but their byproducts as well. Here we see drastic changes in the all-important butyrate, shown with black circles, from 2 donors as we shift from a pH of 5.5 to 6.5. They attributed, at least in part, the reduction in butyrate to correlated reductions in Roseburia. I think by now you're becoming familiar with the names of these taxa. Roseburia is an incredible genus with excellent data points. And since we're not going to conduct FMTs on everyone, and since Roseburia, F. Prausnitzii, E. rectale, and many others do not exist as probiotics, then how do we maximize their presence to create a microbiome with a Goldilocks zone of roughly 5.5 to something, let's just say, shy of 6.5? We're not going to get there with some nutty diet that supposedly makes you more alkaline, or like low FODMAPs, taking out prebiotics to alleviate symptoms, while worsening the microbiome in the long run. We want to feed the health promoters with the fuels they love. For example, multiple studies show that inulin increases the abundance of members from Anerostipes, a genus which houses 2 of the species which make butyrate directly from lactate. Inulin also increases F. Prausnitzii and E. rectale, among others. We want to drive short-chain fatty acid production with butyrate as our primary thought. We're not going to ingest probes to measure your pH, or take other crazy supplements or diets to try to outsmart evolution. We're simply going to feed the known good bacteria the fuels they love and let them figure it out. The protocol varies from person to person and condition to condition, but that's why I'm here. And yes, diet clearly plays a role too. Sure, too much protein is not good for the microbiome. And if you're on a ketogenic diet, we're going to support it with prebiotics. I have a webinar dedicated to this. And yes, dysbiotic people tend to be reactive to foods, dairy being the top of the list. But we're not going to remove cold water fish, blueberries, and walnuts from your diet. And we're not going to take out garlic, asparagus, onions, and apples, just like the low FODMAPs diet suggests. We're just going to take care of this powerful foreign ecosystem inside of us. And when we do that, it will return the favor. If you watch this video during its release, I will host a free roundtable webinar this Thursday evening for the Microbiome University members with questions pertaining to this presentation. If you saw this after the fact, you'll be able to view the house roundtable. If you still need further assistance, you can make an appointment to speak with me on Fridays.